Hello there. And it is afternoon here on Monday, November 17th. I always find November goes by so very quickly. Um, Here in Canada, we've already celebrated Thanksgiving back in October, and we had a beautiful October where I live in southern Ontario. But November has been cold, rainy, hail, stormy, windy, snow. 2 weeks in, we've had some interesting weather. What I'm going to talk about today is something I see quite often in my practice, but haven't really settled down to write or speak about. And so, after I wrote a blog post or an article for the website earlier today, I thought I would just pop on to YouTube and talk a little bit about this because I know this causes so much suffering. So, what I'm going to talk about is estrangement, particularly estrangement within families. I recognize this is a very broad topic. I would say that there are five more common reasons that people become estranged. And what I'm focusing on here is parent and adult child estrangement versus, say, sibling estrangement, although those two things can be very much connected. But estrangement, I would define by saying that people may be thinking of one another, but not in regular communication. So there's been a breach in the connection, there's been a breakdown of trust, perhaps, or there's a grudge being held, or there's just been a gradual withdrawal of investment in the relationship. This can be two-sided, this can be one-sided. What you're going to hear me talk about is a little bit more one-sided. And so what I'm referring to is typically the reasons why an adult child stops being in communication with a parent or parents. And so I'll try to be as organized as I can be. But one of the more common reasons I see here is due to, um, you can hear me now, I'm stuck because there's so much to say. During the pandemic, this was one of the most common issues people brought into the therapy practice. So, either during the pandemic, virtually, or after we were able to see people in person coming into the physical office. But differences of opinion related to the COVID-19 rules and regulations, particularly masks and immunization, was a common reason. And that seems to have opened a Pandora's box of reasons for people being out of contact with one another. And indeed, I think this was the real nucleus for some of the estrangement issues we're seeing 5 years later. Another common reason, and these all interconnect and overlap in some way, is a history of parental alienation. So if this is you I'm referring to, if you are divorced or separated, but particularly divorced, and that child for or children formed an alliance with the other partner, with their mother or father, as it were, this can set the stage for estrangement earlier on. So, early parental alienation, where the child, under some level of manipulation and duress, chooses to have an alliance with one parent and not be in contact with the other, this, of course, can create an ongoing issue with estrangement in their adult years. A lot of people think that parental alienation happens because of the divorce, and so that the child will choose. And yeah, that definitely happens. But if you are in a relationship or a marriage with someone who's narcissistic, it is very likely that that grooming and manipulation happened well before the divorce, in terms of the things that they would say about you, in terms of that child being afraid to reject the other parent. And so this is definitely something I will hear as a reason for estrangement. And particularly if that child, that adult child, has chosen sides, picked sides, um, that alienation, as I said, can turn into estrangement later on. It also, I think, becomes a phenomenon, and I'm going to talk more about this later, of simple avoidance, and where the more time that passes, the more challenging it is to resume that connection. So, a third reason, I may end up here with six instead of five, at any rate, a third and probably the most common reason I hear is what I'm going to call the in-law effect. Now, Joshua Coleman refers to this as the cult of one, but what I'm referring to is if you have an adult son, it's usually a son, although it can be a daughter, who has married, you may find that they become very influenced by their partner. Again, this is more commonly a daughter-in-law, but it can be a son-in-law. She may have more of an affinity or an alliance or a loyalty to her own family, and may in fact be enmeshed with particularly her mother or her father. And you may find that they're spending a lot more time with her family. The other thing about this is there can be favoritism shown at special occasions. We're coming up to some right now, right? With Christmas season coming. There can be ways that things need to be done, certain foods that need to be eaten, certain ways that things are celebrated. I mean, the list goes on and on. But your child, your adult child, becomes isolated. They seem to forget how to be able to think for themselves. They seem oriented to whatever their partner does or says, particularly in the first 5 to 10 years of marriage, which then begins to look like a cult, right? Because they've lost some of their identity in all of this. And some of this is what I used to call growing pains, right? It is the norms and rituals and traditions that need to be reorganized, after someone gets married. But where the rubber really hits the road with this is when a baby comes along, and it becomes, most cases, the daughter's parents have all the time with the grandchild, and the son's parents are put aside. And this absolutely can be due to some type of personality or character pathology with the in-law. And this is probably why people seek me out to talk about this. But in my experience, this is the most common dynamic, the most common reason, at least why I'm hearing about estrangement. And it can be particularly painful because it can feel like you've lost your adult son or daughter. And again, as time passes, it can be more challenging to get that back, to reclaim the connection of that relationship. Another reason why this can happen is due to what I call your adult child becoming an armchair psychologist, right? It's kind of like armchair quarterbacking, but armchair labeling and diagnosing. And I am trained in nonviolent communication. And so I know that when diagnosing happens within a relationship, this can be pretty damning. Now, this hit critical mass about the same time that people who shall remain nameless started cranking out YouTube videos. Yes, I know I'm being ironic, that people would go and watch, and so your adult child is seeking validation for the way they feel by labeling a parent with a personality disorder, the most common one being narcissism. Now, the interesting thing about this, and if you read my book, you'll know that I'm quite opinionated about this, is the diagnostic criteria for any kind of mental health issue, as it tends to be presented, is not meant to be used to label our loved ones. If you want to do that, that's fine. I don't think it's helpful. And so many a parent has received, links to videos, pages of websites, links to websites, I should say, website pages that would be completely confusing. So, yeah, sometimes, a parent really does have a personality character pathology. They're toxic, they're very difficult, for sure. That's not what I hear all the time. And often this can indeed be the adult child who has personality pathology, right? Which I haven't mentioned, and it probably needs to go in its own category, but it applies to everything that I'm saying. But another common reason, as I've said, is, there is some type of rupture in the relationship. There's a disagreement. Sometimes the parent hasn't given that child what they want. And then off they go to research all of the things that are wrong with this parent and build their case for going no contact. And that has been a real phenomenon among millennials. And one of the things that I've observed in that generation of people, I'm Gen X for the record, is at times they can value information over connection. I see this generation as being very disconnected. They're disconnected from one another. They're disconnected in their relationships. They're disconnected from their children, but very connected to information. And I might get blasted for this, and that's okay. And I am overgeneralizing. But the going no contact with parents is part of that phenomenon. And on the flip side of this can be just simply not valuing those relationships outside of what might be more transactional. So just to reiterate that, the cause of this estrangement is both, the labeling and diagnosing as a parent, but underpinning that can be the adult child's own character pathology. And this is a phase that I went through myself. I mean, I think the difference for me was that my focus in graduate school was personality pathology. And, I had to read all of this information, but I don't think that that's always a helpful approach to take. And even if you have a parent who has, severe personality pathology, it makes more sense to have healthy boundaries versus going no contact, where that person tends to live rent free in your head. The exception to this rule is if there has been any kind of abuse, financial, mental, physical, sexual, and your safety, your family's safety is at issue, then that would make sense. And I'm flipping back and forth here with respect to who I'm speaking to on this subject. I realize that, but that's also a fairly common way that people become estranged. And another one, which connects into what I've just said, there's some overlap, is what I would call just people who are low effort, right? I've heard this term and there's read some things about it. I've seen some social media reels about this, and I think this is incredibly common across the board anyway. But I think that since 2020, there's been a real tear in the social fabric. in my opinion. Friends don't see each other the way they once did. Families don't gather the way they once did. I think that most of us adjusted to that. But I also think that there are people who simply just, I don't want to say they don't care because I don't think that's fair, but I think that there's a bit of like a low effort, right? And it can feel uncomfortable or awkward or vulnerable to reach out to someone. Um, what I'm going to weave in here too is if there's been conflict and then someone avoids. So that could be a separate reason, but I'm going to say them both together. And so it's easier and it's a lot less uncomfortable to just avoid the person than to try and have a difficult conversation and resolve it. And that again overlaps with this idea of this kind of like why bother or this procrastination. And then this is again one of those scenarios where, the longer you go without talking to someone, the more difficult it is to reconnect with them. The more vulnerable it might feel, the more we're trying to avoid that discomfort or trying to avoid more conflict. And I think that we all would still carry, some suffering about this, but I hear this as well. Now, we all might have different reasons for not talking to someone. And estrangement, I think, is the longer term outcome of all of the different scenarios that I've just described. And it really boils down to what you value, what's important to you, um, who you want to have in your life, in your social circle. I mean, even I have been guilty of saying, that you want people around you who are nourishing and have good energy. But I also think that familial connection of some description is important, even if it is highly boundaried and it's happening on your own terms. The answer to the issue of estrangement is an equally complex and layered one. Therapy can be helpful. I think mediation would probably be more helpful, like a mediated coaching approach. Approaches that integrate simple, open doors to communication and ways of demonstrating empathy for the other person. So there needs to be this shared, equal sense of empathy for the other person and where they're coming from. I also think that self compassion and loving kindness meditation can be helpful, and a level of doing forgiveness work. So I think it takes much less energy to come to some type of mutual understanding and have boundary contact than it is to hold a grudge and go into, a time of great estrangement. As a parting comment, I think people with narcissistic personality disorder are experts at holding grudges and being estranged. It's kind of like the only tool in their box sometimes if there's conflict. But and that might be, one exception to everything that I have just said. So again, this was a very quick overview and by no means an exhaustive list of the reasons why people become estranged, but they are the most common ones I hear in my therapy practice. If this resonates with you, get in the conversation, like, subscribe, share. If you need some help with this, reach out. We can set something up, whether that's in my Peterborough office or virtually, just like this, except you're on the other side of the screen. This is something that I have been developing some expertise and best practice around over the last 5 years. And as a parting comment, if this is you, my heart goes out to you. You know, you have my understanding and my compassion, and I do wish you well on that journey. Until we meet again, take good care.